2012, ESTIBALIZ CARRANZA, dubbed the ice cream killer by the Austrian media, was sentenced to life behind bars for the brutal dismemberment murders of her ex-husband and her one-time lover, on separate occasions. She shot them both in the head and carved up their bodies. After several failed attempts to dispose of the first corpse, including the crazy idea of setting fire to it, Carranza finally decided to resort to dismembering the corpses with a chainsaw. She stored their body parts in a freezer that also served as a storeroom for the ice cream parlor. She concealed them in chunks of concrete that she mixed up in the cellar and then buried their remains under the concrete floor of her shop. She then hung air fresheners to hide the smell of their rotting corpses. When arrested, Carranza was 2 months pregnant by another man whom she married in prison. An American woman who claimed that God ordered her to bash in her sons' heads, has been acquitted of all charges after a jury in Tyler, Texas, decided she did not know right from wrong at the time. It found that Deanna Laney, 39, was legally insane when, on Mother's Day weekend at 11:30 p.m. on May 9, 2003, she woke and took Joshua, 8, to the yard of her home in New Chapel Hill, Texas, where she lifted a large rock over her head and brought it down against his skull, fatally wounding him. She then dragged her 6-year-old son, Luke, to the same area, and killed him in the same manner. Afterwards, she attempted to kill 14-month-old Aaron in his crib with a stone. He was found alive with a pillow placed over his face but suffered severe head injuries. She was released with conditions in 2012. Abdelali Hadi, known as the Butcher of Taraudant, was a Moroccan serial killer responsible for killing 9 children age 11 to 16 between 2000 and 2004. On August 20, 2004, local residents stumbled upon human remains including multiple skeletons and 8 skulls scattered throughout the Taraudant Valley. They contacted the police. On August 7, 2004, police officers went to Hadi's house, and when he opened the door, he said, "I have been waiting for you to save me from my torture. I have been suffering day and night. I want to sleep and heal." When asked if he was the child murderer, he confessed and was taken into custody. Hadi admitted to having a 9th victim and that he had an orgasm while choking his victims. Hadi died on May 6, 2022, while on death row at Mal al-Burki Central Prison. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov is a Russian serial killer, rapist, and necrophile, who committed the sexual assault and murder of 78 girls and women between 1992 and 2010 in Angarsk, Irkutsk, in Siberia, and Vladivostok in Far East. Although he has confessed to at least 83 in total, he is known as the werewolf. For the particularly brutal nature of his crimes, he would extensively mutilate the bodies of his victims, and perform sexual acts on them. Popkov, a former police officer, was convicted of 22 murders in 2015 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He confessed to an additional 59 3 years later. On December 10, 2018, he was convicted for 56 of the 59 additional killings and given a second life sentence. Dallin Bounce was an American serial killer who killed 4 victims in South Carolina. On June 26, 1999, Radio Shack employee Jonathan Lemuel Lara was restrained with flex ties to a chair in the back room of a Radio Shack in Greenville, South Carolina. Lara was stabbed in the neck with a screwdriver and subsequently died. December 22, 1999. Bounce walked into a tiny flower shop on a busy street in broad daylight and killed the 30-year-old clerk, Karen Moore Hayden, by slicing her throat and leaving her face down in a back storage room in a pool of blood. Bounce killed an acquaintance, Sandy Roberts Ott, and her ex-husband Timothy Ott. In the ex-husband's home in Easley, Bounce fled the house and took refuge in a neighborhood several miles away. Holding 2 women hostage, Bounce killed himself shortly thereafter with a gunshot to the head. Melanie Smith, 43, a self-confessed alcoholic, set fire to a baby's pushchair because she was fed up with it being outside her front door. But the blaze spread into a devastating inferno which ripped through the first-floor flat in Prestadon, North Wales, October 2012. It trapped and killed Leanna Shires, 20, her partner Liam Timbrell, 23, their baby son Charlie, 15 months, Miss Shires' nephew Bailey, 4, and niece Sky, 2, who lived in the flat below. The court heard Smith was ranting about her throwing cigarette butts and shouted up at Miss Shires, "I am going to set your house on fire with you and your kids in it." She was sentenced to life in prison with a 30-year minimum, on May 7, 2013. Virginia Krall was convicted in August 2009 of second-degree murder for the June 16, 2006 killing of Yolanda Meraz, 37, who was stabbed 30 times in the 4300 block of Quigley Avenue. Along with 3 counts of attempted murder for the stabbings of Meraz's mother, daughter, and sister during the pre-dawn attack, at about 3 a.m., Virginia Krall, 22, carrying a 12-inch knife, allegedly climbed through a side window and stabbed and slashed Meraz's daughter, sister, and mother at the family's Lakewood home. Krall was arrested at the crime scene by sheriff's deputies and has remained jailed since then. She believed that there were devils in the world and that she was selected by God to attack and kill these devils. She was sentenced to just over 36 years to life in prison. Miroslav Stalik was a Czech sadistic murderer, who committed a total of 14 completed or attempted rapes in Prague in 1983, killing 2 of the attacked women. He had both sadistic and masochistic tendencies. He would cause conflicts at school because he enjoyed being beaten by other children. He began to commit violence against women. He forced them to have sex using a hunting knife which he carried with him. He was known to rob, strangle, rape, and murder his victims. On August 10, 1983, the body of Zdenka H. was found. The victim was undressed and left in a position indicative of a sexual assault. On the same day he attacked 2 more women. On August 18, the resident of an apartment building in Vršovice reported the discovery of a body. He was hanged by President Husak on February 25, 1986 in the Pankrak prison in Prague. Richard Trenton Chase, aka the Vampire of Sacramento, was an American serial killer, cannibal, and necrophile who killed 6 people in 1977 and 1978 in Sacramento, California. He drank his victims' blood, cannibalized their internal organs, and would engage in necrophilia with his female victims. He did this as part of a delusion that he needed to prevent Nazis from turning his blood into powder via poison they had planted beneath his soap dish. The jury found him guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death on May 8, 1979. He was placed on death row, but was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. On December 26, 1980, age 30, the serial killer had been given prescribed medication, which he saved up to eventually overdose. Richard Trenton Chase, aka the Vampire of Sacramento, was an American serial killer, cannibal, and necrophile who killed 6 people in 1977 and 1978 in Sacramento, California. He drank his victims' blood, cannibalized their internal organs, and would engage in necrophilia with his female victims. He did this as part of a delusion that he needed to prevent Nazis from turning his blood into powder via poison they had planted beneath his soap dish. The jury found him guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death on May 8, 1979. He was placed on death row, but was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. On December 26, 1980, age 30, the serial killer had been given prescribed medication, which he saved up to eventually overdose. David Fuller is a convicted English murderer and necrophile. In 2021, he was convicted of the murders of Wendy Nell, 25, and Caroline Pearce, 20, whom he strangled and sexually assaulted after breaking into their homes, months apart in 1987, in Royal Tunbridge Wells, Kent, in what became known as the Betsett murders. When finally apprehended, Fuller also received 12 years for mortuary offenses, having recorded himself abusing the bodies of more than 100 female corpses, over the course of his employment as an electrician at the Kent and Sussex Hospital, also in Tunbridge Wells, and the Tunbridge Wells Hospital in nearby Pembury, which replaced it. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order on December 15, 2021. George Leather is a brutal murderer, who used 4 kitchen knives to inflict between 50 and 100 injuries to 56-year-old Paula Leather's face and neck, and between 200 to 300 injuries to her body, leaving her mutilated and her face destroyed beyond recognition. Having broken multiple blades during the murder, Leather left her for dead at the foot of the stairs in their Prescott, Merseyside home in England, and whilst behind bars over the savage attack, he hounded their kids with letters from jail, ordering them to get him possessions he'd left at the murder scene. George wrongly suspected his wife of having an affair. The 60-year-old was sentenced to a minimum of 18 years after admitting murdering Paula at 1:20 a.m. on November 16, 2020. A post-mortem concluded the grandmother died from stab wounds to the head. The 2009 Kuwait wedding fire was an arson attack that occurred during a wedding ceremony in Kuwait on August 15, 2009. At least 57 people were killed and about 90 others wounded when the groom's 23-year-old first wife, Nusra Youssef Mohammed Al-Enazi, to take revenge for her husband taking a second wife, poured petrol on a tent where women and children were celebrating and set it on fire. Within around 3 minutes the whole tent was engulfed in flames, trapping many inside. It was the deadliest civilian disaster in Kuwait in the last 40 years. Many of the bodies were burnt beyond recognition. In March 2010, Nusra was found guilty of 57 counts of premeditated murder and starting a fire with the intent to kill and sentenced to death. She was hanged at Central Prison on January 25, 2017. Robert Pickton is a Canadian serial killer known as the Pig Farmer Killer. Pickton was convicted in 2007 on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was accused of murdering 20 other women, mostly prostitutes. He was known to torture, strangle, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. In 1997, Pickton was charged with the attempted murder of a prostitute by handcuffing and stabbing her. Pickton was held at Eagle Ridge Hospital after being stabbed by the victim. The charges were dismissed in 1998 due to the victim being unreliable. Pickton claims his total number of victims was 49. On February 22, 2002, police arrested Robert Pickton at his farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Dennis Rader is an American serial killer known as BTK, an abbreviation he gave himself for bind, torture, kill, the BTK Strangler, or the BTK Killer. Between 1974 and 1991, he killed 10 people in Wichita and Park City, Kansas, and sent taunting letters to police and media outlets. He was known to stalk, torture, strangle, and murder his victims. After a decade-long hiatus, Rader resumed sending letters in 2004. He claimed to be driven to kill by Factor X, which he characterized as a supernatural element that also motivated Jack the Ripper, the son of Sam, and the Hillside Strangler murders. He was arrested in 2005 and is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. Christopher Daniel Dunce, is a former American neurosurgeon nicknamed Dr. Death, for gross malpractice resulting in the maiming of several patients' spines and 2 deaths while working at hospitals in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Some victims were paralyzed, while others suffered severe nerve damage and had to endure chronic pain. In July 2012, he performed surgery on a woman who lost massive amounts of blood after waking up and eventually died. One of his friends and patients underwent spinal surgery only to return from the procedure with a broken vertebral artery. Dunce was accused of injuring 33 out of 38 patients in less than 2 years before his license was revoked by the Texas Medical Board. In 2017, he was convicted of maiming one of his patients and sentenced to life imprisonment. Bryn Hartman was the wife and murderer of actor and comedian Phil Hartman, who had starred in such movies as 1994's Greedy, and popular TV show The Simpsons. On May 28, 1998, she fatally shot him once between the eyes, once in the throat, and once in the upper chest with the Charter Arms .38 caliber handgun. Around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., she drove to her friend Ron Douglas' house and confessed, but he did not believe her. At 6:20 a.m., the two of them drove back to the Hartman home where Douglas discovered the body. Douglas subsequently called the police, who arrived on the scene to escort the 2 children out of the house. Before the police attended to her, Hartman went back into the bedroom and killed herself with a second revolver, shooting herself in the right eye. Tamara Samsonova is a Russian serial killer known as the Granny Ripper. During her crimes as a serial killer, she was known to commit acts of cannibalism, mutilate, and murder her victims. Samsonova confessed in her diary to 11 murders. In 2015, Samsonova was arrested on suspicion of murdering a 79-year-old woman and dismembering her body. She killed her tenant. He was a 44-year-old resident from Norilsk. She then dismembered his corpse, and disposed of it on the streets of St. Denis's Way. She confessed to eating parts of some of her victims' bodies, and cutting other victims into pieces and disposing of them in the Frunzensky district of Russia. Samsonova is being investigated in connection to a total of 14 murders. She sits in a psychiatric hospital in Russia, awaiting her fate. Derrick Todd Lee, also known as the Baton Rouge serial killer, was an American serial killer. Between 1992 and 2003, Lee murdered 7 women in the Baton Rouge area. Prior to his murder charges, Lee had been arrested for stalking women and watching them in their homes. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to commit acts of necrophilia, stalk, rape, and murder his victims. Lee was linked by DNA evidence to the deaths of 7 women in Baton Rouge and Lafayette, Louisiana between 1992 and 2002. Lee is believed to have murdered several other women in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Lee was convicted of 3 of the murders and sentenced to death by lethal injection in 2004. In 2016, Derrick Todd Lee died of heart disease at the Lane Regional Medical Center in Zachary, Louisiana. Rebecca Olenchok beat her mother, Kimberly Vinos, with a baseball bat, then poured kerosene around her as she lay unconscious. After igniting the kerosene, Olenchok snapped a padlock on the shack's door, trapping Vinos inside, and drove away, her clothes ablaze. Vinos broke through a wall of the flaming shack and stumbled toward the road, crying for help. Before she succumbed to heart failure, she told a paramedic that her daughter had tried to kill her. The murder occurred on October 17, 2010, in a homeless encampment behind the pathmark on Durham Road, Bristol Township, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, USA. Rebecca Olenchok was found guilty, but mentally ill, and sentenced to life in prison without parole on October 12, 2011. On August 15, 1975, Ted Bundy fled from a patrol car. When the police caught up to him and searched his 1968 Volkswagen Beetle, they found the following suspicious objects: a crowbar behind the driver's seat, a box of large green plastic garbage bags, an ice pick, a flashlight, a pair of gloves, torn strips of sheeting, a knit ski mask, a pair of handcuffs, and a strange mask made from pantyhose. They also noticed that the passenger seat had been removed. They later released him. Little did they know they had just set free one of the worst serial killers in American history. Eventually, Utah authorities seized the 1968 Volkswagen and examined it inch by inch, finding hairs that matched 3 potential victims. The Ted Bundy Volkswagen is currently on display at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum. Dr. Theodore John Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, is an American domestic terrorist who engaged in a mail bombing spree that spanned nearly 20 years. He was a mathematics prodigy, but abandoned his academic career in 1969 to pursue a more primitive life. Between 1978 and 1995, Kaczynski killed 3 people and injured 23 others in a nationwide mail bombing campaign against people he believed to be advancing modern technology and the destruction of the environment. He authored Industrial Society and Its Future, a 35,000-word manifesto and social critique opposing industrialization, rejecting leftism, and advocating for a nature-centered form of anarchism. He was sentenced to 4 life terms in prison on May 5, 1998. In the early hours of April 15, 1988 in Bahar County, Texas, high on cocaine and after 3 six-packs of beer, Leopoldo Narvaez barged into the trailer home of his ex-girlfriend Shannon Mann, 17, and killed her and her sisters, Jennifer, 19, Martha, 15, and brother Ernest Jr., 11. Shannon's body was found nude and she had been stabbed 5 times and both of her arms were broken. Jennifer was found partially nude and had been stabbed 23 times. Martha also was partially nude and received 9 stab wounds. Shannon's brother received between 63 and 67 stab wounds. On the night of the attack, a mortally wounded Shannon Mann called 911 and identified Narvaez. He was executed by lethal injection in Texas on June 26, 1998. Sayano Horimoto was a 12-year-old 6th grader at Shinmei Primary School. She became uncomfortable around 23-year-old Yu Hagino, a teacher at a cram school in Uji, Kyoto Prefecture. Sayano complained to her parents about the teacher when he became suggestive around her. On December 10, 2005, Hagino sent the other students outside. He then disconnected a security camera and approached the seated girl from behind. He tried to hit her with a hammer, but failed. He then stabbed her in the neck, head, and face with a kitchen knife more than 10 times. Hagino then pushed her to the floor and then stabbed her at least 3 more times in the neck. The Osaka High Court sentenced him to 15 years imprisonment on March 24, 2009. Jessica Tata, 24, was sentenced to 80 years for a murder conviction in the death of one of 4 children that were killed in a fire at her home daycare in Houston. She was convicted for the death of 16-month-old Elias Castillo. Elias was one of 7 children whom Tata left unsupervised while she went to a nearby Target store. She left a pan of oil on a stovetop burner and this ignited the February 2011 blaze. 3 other children were seriously injured. Neighbors said that they heard the children crying during their unsuccessful attempts to rescue them from the blaze. Tata fled to Nigeria in the wake of the fire but was captured after about a month. Along with the prison sentence, Tata was ordered to pay a $10,000 fine. A judge dropped the remaining 8 cases against Tata in order for her to begin her prison sentence. GEIN made at least 40 nighttime visits to local graveyards, to exhume recently buried corpses and take them home to make his gruesome art. He made faces into lampshades, a belt fashioned from women's nipples. There were also human skulls used as decorative bedposts, lips as a curtain drawstring, a wastebasket made of human skin, chair seats covered in human skin, several female skulls, some with the tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso, skin from shoulders to waist, a pair of lips on a window-shaped drawstring, 4 noses, 2 vulvas from teenage girls, 9 women's vulvae in a shoebox, Bernice Worton's heart in a plastic bag, Bernice Worton's head in a sack, masks made from female faces, leggings made from human leg skin. Henryk Kukula is a Polish serial killer, pedophile, and necrophile, nicknamed the Monster from Kurzow. From September 1980 to July 1990 he raped and murdered 4 children. When he was 14 years old, he murdered a 5-year-old girl. After killing her, he desecrated the corpse. The young murderer was placed in an educational facility in Krupski when he beat the 9-year-old son of the educator to death, raping the corpse afterwards. He was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for the crime. In April 1990, Kukula left the prison, and in July of the same year he raped and murdered 2 brothers in Ruda Slaska. For this crime, he was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. His sentence expired in 2020, but he was kept in and remains in custody. Bruce Mendenhall is a convicted American murderer and serial killer, known as the Truck Stop Killer. Mendenhall worked as a long-haul trucker. He has been charged with the murders of 3 women at truck stops in Alabama, Indiana, and Tennessee. Mendenhall is suspected for murders in Georgia, Illinois, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. Mendenhall was arrested at a truck stop in Nashville, Tennessee, in 2007. A large quantity of bloody clothing and identification, personal effects, a plastic sack along with blood spots scattered around the inside of his cab and on the steering wheel, and even on his hands when arrested. Mendenhall was sentenced to life in prison. In 2010, he was sentenced to an additional 30 years in prison for soliciting the murders of 3 witnesses in his upcoming murder trial. Marino is an American serial killer. She was convicted in June 1999 of murdering 8 of her children. Between 1949 and 1968, 8 of the 10 no children died of mysterious causes which were then attributed to sudden infant death syndrome. All 8 children were healthy at birth and were developing normally. 2 other children died of natural causes. No pled guilty in June 1999 to 8 counts of second-degree murder, and was sentenced to 20 years of probation with the first 5 years under house arrest and psychiatric study. As a condition of her plea agreement, No agreed to psychiatric study in hopes of identifying what caused her to kill her children. In September 2001, a study was filed with the court that stated No was suffering from mixed personality disorder. Darrell Peter is an American convicted murderer. On September 24, 1993, Pandeli picked up the victim, Holly EYLER. He paid the victim to have sex with him, but he was unable to maintain an erection. He decided that he wanted his money back. Pandeli claimed that the victim attacked him. Pandeli slit the victim's throat. He mutilated her corpse and cut off her nipples. He then dumped her body in an alley. Later, he flushed the nipples down a toilet. After being captured and interrogated for that murder, he confessed to killing Holly Humphreys more than a year before the EYLER murder. He was tried separately for the murder of Humphreys, and convicted of second-degree murder. Darrell Pandeli was convicted in 1997, and was eventually sentenced to death in 2017. Adij Camara, is an Indian serial killer, known as the Darzi of Death. He has confessed to the murder of 33 truck drivers and their apprentices. He used to befriend the targets at food joints, and drug them before killing them. He was known to rob, strangle, mutilate, and murder his victims. Cameras says he dumped their bodies in isolated locations and sold off the trucks and goods. He remembers every little detail about everyone he has killed. The victim's last meal, where they ate, what they wore, where and how he was killed, and where exactly the body was dumped. The details are blood-curdling. The injuries were exactly where he said he had dealt the blows. Adish Kamra was arrested in September of 2018 by a female officer from the Bhopal police, in Mundyd'S, in Madhya Pradesh's Raisin district of India. Ernest Ingenito was an American spree killer. In November 1950, Ingenito drove to the Mazzoli house. He shot his father-in-law twice, killing him. As his wife fled, Ingenito shot her in the stomach and shoulder. When his mother-in-law fled, he shot her mother, then killed his wife's pregnant aunt. He wounded his wife's 9-year-old cousin, then shot and killed his mother-in-law. Ingenito also killed his mother-in-law's brother. He then drove to Minatola and shot his wife's aunt and uncle. Ingenito was arrested by the New Jersey State Police. He was released in 1974. In 1994, Ingenito was arrested again for sexual assault. He was found guilty on 29 counts and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He died in prison of heart failure on October 7, 1995. Larry William EYLER, aka the Interstate Killer, was an American serial killer. Between 1982 and 1984, EYLER is known to have committed a minimum of 21 murders. Victims were subjected to varying degrees of sadomasochism before being stabbed to death, with the majority of the wounds being inflicted to the victim's chest and abdomen. His victims were typically plied with alcohol and sedatives, such as ethchlorvinol, before their restraint and murder. Several victims were disemboweled after death, and EYLER is known to have dismembered the bodies of 4 of his victims. His victims were typically discarded in fields close to major interstate highways, with their trousers and underwear frequently discovered around their knees or ankles and their shirts missing. EYLER died of AIDS-related complications in 1994 while incarcerated on death row. Leatrice Brewer drowned and stabbed her 3 children believing that she was saving them from voodoo. On February 24, 2008, Brewer stabbed her 6-year-old daughter, Jewel Ward. She then drowned her daughter and sons, 5-year-old Michael Deemsyo, and 18-month-old Innocent Deemsyo Jr. in the bathtub of their Newcastle apartment. Next, Brewer attempted suicide by swallowing aspirin and household cleaners. When she awoke, she tried again by jumping out a second-story window. She pleaded not responsible by reason of mental disease on February 9, 2009. Incarcerated indefinitely at Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Center. While in state custody, she got pregnant and gave birth 4 years ago to a baby boy who is now in foster care. The boy's father is another patient. Francisco Acevedo is an American serial killer who was convicted of strangling 3 women to death in New York between 1989 and 1996. All 3 women were naked, their bodies facing skyward, their hands bound behind their backs and left in South Yonkers over a 7-year span, 2 in a remote industrial neighborhood, the other at an East Side motel. Described as sexual posing, he was posing bodies to get some type of psychological charge. Only about 1% of the nation's killers are sexual posers. Acevedo was linked to the murders in 2009, after voluntarily giving his DNA as a parole condition for drunk driving. In 2012 he was found guilty of the murders and was sentenced 3 times to 25 years to life imprisonment, each to be served consecutively, totaling to a minimum of 75 years. Arthur Shawcross was an American serial killer, known as the Genesee River Strangler. He was arrested in 1972 for the rape and murder of 2 children. He was released on parole in 1987. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to commit acts of cannibalism, strangle, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. Shawcross killed most of his victims from 1988 to 1989 after his parole. He would rape, strangle, and beat, mostly prostitute victims prior to killing them. Shawcross once claimed to have eaten the vulvas of 3 victims and the genitals of another. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On November 10, 2008, he was taken to Albany Medical Center where he went into cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at 9:50 p.m. Keisha Golden, 33, was heavily pregnant when she fatally stabbed her boyfriend, just hours after the couple held their baby shower, during a fight over who would get to use the microwave to reheat food. She was arrested October 23 and charged with first-degree murder in the stabbing death of her boyfriend, Calvin Sidney, 29. The 8 months pregnant woman knocked a plate out of Sidney's hands, and he retaliated by shoving her. Sidney stormed off to a bedroom, where Golden allegedly stabbed him in the leg with a knife, and left the apartment after dropping the weapon. The boyfriend's femoral artery was reportedly cut in the attack. He died at Mount Sinai Hospital. A few hours later, Golden was arrested after she returned home, unaware that Sidney was dead. Ramadan Abdel Rahim Mansour was an Egyptian serial killer known as the Express Train. He was known to torture, rape, and murder his victims. Mansour raped and tortured homeless children, mostly boys aged 10 to 14 years old. Mansour lured street children onto the carriage roof of the trains, where he then stripped, raped and tortured them, and tossed them naked onto the trackside, dead or barely alive. The murders took place aboard trains between Cairo, Alexandria, Calliope, and Beni Suef. Some of his victims were thrown into the Nile River, and at least 1 victim was buried alive. In 2007, Mansour was convicted by the criminal court in Tanta. He was also found guilty of illegal possession of weapons. Ramadan Abdel Rahim Mansour was executed by hanging in 2010. The box incident occurred in 1989. Jeffrey Dahmer was living at his grandmother's home in West Allis, Wisconsin. His dad came to visit and happened to see it, a 1-foot square metal and wood box, and was wondering what was in it. He said, "Jeff, open it up, I just want to see what's in there." They got into a bit of an argument because he wouldn't open it. His father then said, "Jeff, open it up or I'm going to just take it down into the basement and get a screwdriver and open it." Jeff got angry, very visibly agitated, not fathoming what could be in the box. His father said, "Okay, open it up tomorrow and then let's get rid of it." The box contained the severed and mummified head and genitals of a young man Dahmer had met in a gay bar in Milwaukee. He killed a dozen more victims before his capture in 1991. Charles Cullen is an American serial killer who worked as a nurse in many hospitals but was repeatedly fired for suspicious behavior. He confessed to murdering 40 elderly patients in New Jersey from 1984 to 2003. He did this by poisoning his patients to death. Some have estimated that Cullen may ultimately be responsible for 400 deaths, which would make him the most prolific serial killer in recorded history. He told detectives in December 2003 that he lived most of his life in a fog, and that he had blacked out the memory of murdering most of his victims. He said he could not recall how many of them there were, or why he had chosen them. On March 2, 2006, Cullen was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences in New Jersey, and is not eligible for parole until 2403. Jana Porter Mallory was sentenced to 30 years in prison for slowly poisoning a 79-year-old woman over 4 months in 2007 and 2008. Mallory took advantage of her neighbor, Peggy Merman, who needed care. She did not have use of her legs and could barely use her arms. She moved in with Mallory, who lived a few doors down. Over the course of several months, Mallory stole money and jewelry, and poisoned Merman by giving her medications that exceeded 10 times her prescribed amount. Mallory was unable to explain the high dosages of drugs and the spending. Police arrested Mallory on charges of second-degree murder and aggravated abuse of the elderly. On Wednesday, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison, followed by 15 years of probation on the murder charge and 5 years in prison on the abuse charge, to be served concurrently. Rodney Alcala was an American serial killer known as the Dating Game Killer, for appearing on the game show The Dating Game in the middle of his killing spree. Alcala was convicted of 5 murders, though his actual total is estimated to be much higher. He was known to torture, strangle, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. Alcala had a locker filled with thousands of photographs of women and children, most in sexually explicit poses, and it is suspected that some of the women photographed may be among Alcala's additional victims. On January 7, 2013, a Manhattan judge sentenced Alcala to 25 years to life. Alcala died of unspecified natural causes in Corcoran, California on July 24, 2021, at the age of 77. Moses Sithole is a South African serial killer known as the ABC Killer. Sithole murdered at least 37 women and 1 toddler between July 16, 1994 and November 6, 1995. He was known to rob, torture, strangle, rape, and murder his victims. Sithole preyed on unemployed women, luring his victims with the prospects of a job before leading them to an isolated place, where he murdered them. They were generally strangled with their own underwear. He once inflicted a head wound on the 2-year-old son of one of his victims and left him to die. He would later phone the victims' families to taunt them. In 1997, Moses Sithole was sentenced to 2,410 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 930 years. He is currently incarcerated in Mangaung Correctional Center in Bloemfontein. Robert Christian Hansen was an American serial killer known as the Butcher Baker, not receiving the attention he wanted from the attractive girls in school. Hansen grew up hating them and nursing fantasies of cruel revenge. Hansen kidnapped prostitutes. He hunted many of them down in the wilderness with a Ruger Mini 14 and a knife. Rape, torture and abduction were among his signatures. Based on discovered remains, police suspect him of 6 murders in addition to the 15 for which he was convicted. An aviation map with X marks was found hidden behind Hansen's headboard. Police later learned the X marks were locations of victims' bodies. He was arrested and convicted in 1983, and was sentenced to 461 years without the possibility of parole. He died in 2014 of natural causes due to lingering health conditions at age 75. Fiona Davis of Green Lanes, Palmer's Green, North London, killed her great-grandmother and her former boyfriend. She stabbed her lover Keith Fernandez 58 times and knifed her 81-year-old great-grandmother Mary Scarrett 130 times on October 14, 2003. She was found not guilty of murder due to insanity. She thought Keith Fernandez was a robot and Scarrett was the devil. She attacked them because she thought Judgment Day had arrived. Later, at Stoke Newington police station, she attempted to strangle herself and smeared crosses on the wall with excrement and blood. She shouted at police, "I am the Messiah and the King of Kings. I will forgive you all." She can never be freed without permission from the Home Office. The 25-year-old was returned to Broadmoor Special Hospital where she is being treated. Ali Asghar Barujerdi was an Iranian serial killer and rapist, known as Asghar the Murderer, the first Iranian serial killer and rapist reported in 20th century. He was known to rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. As a child, he started assaulting, raping, and later murdering adolescent boys in Baghdad when he was 14 years old. Barujerdi was convicted of killing 33 young boys in Iraq and Iran, 8 in Tehran, most of them homeless vagrants. The first bodies, heads severed, were found on December 31, 1933, and 25 in Baghdad. Barujerdi was convicted, and after an unsuccessful appeal, he was sentenced to death. In 1934, Ali Asghar Barujerdi was executed by public hanging in front of a crowd in Tehran's Sepah Square. William Bonin was an American serial killer who was known as the Freeway Killer, as the majority of his victims were discarded alongside various Southern California freeways. Bonin underwent 2 psychiatric examinations, and he was determined to be a sexual psychopath who had little control over his impulses. He committed the rape, torture, and murder of a minimum of 21 young men and boys in Southern California from May 1979 to June 1980. One of his victims had been bound, beaten about the face, sodomized, then stabbed in the neck and genitalia and bludgeoned about the skull. Attempts had also been made to remove his testicles and slash his throat. In March 1969, Bonin was convicted of 14 of the freeway murders and died on February 23, 1996, age 49, by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. James Wood was an American serial killer and rapist. He would kidnap, rape, molest, commit acts of necrophilia on the body, and dismember the corpse of his victims. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1993 for the June 29 kidnapping, dismemberment, and murder of an 11-year-old newspaper delivery girl in Pocatello, Idaho. He kidnapped her at gunpoint before shooting her in the head. He kept the body for over a week, repeatedly raping it, before finally dismembering the remains. He was arrested in 1993 and later led authorities to the body that had been thrown into the Snake River in Idaho Falls. In 2004, James Edward Wood died from a heart attack at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho. Carlette Parker was a home health care worker who kidnapped 88-year-old Alice Covington, withdrew money from Covington's account, and then drowned her in a bathtub. Her body was subsequently found inside her 1993 Mercury Sable, which had been abandoned in a Morrisville field. When examined, Covington had bruising around her ankles and legs, pepper spray on her clothing, and possible burns from a stun gun. At the time of her arrest, Parker had a stun gun and pepper spray in her possession. Police suspect Parker may have victimized other elderly people as well, and said these charges not only involve Covington, but at least 3 other victims. Parker was convicted of kidnapping and murder of Alice Covington, given the death penalty, and sent to death row in North Carolina. Nikolai Jumagaliev is a Soviet serial killer and rapist known as the Metal Fang. He was known to commit acts of cannibalism, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. Jumagaliev was convicted for the killing and cannibalism of 7 people between 1979 and 1980. He is known as the Metal Fang due to his false metal teeth. Jumagaliev lured female prostitutes who were working local parks during the nighttime hours. He would lure, attack, and hack his victims with an axe, as part of a plan to rid the world of prostitution. Jumagaliev claimed to have cooked parts of his victims to eat himself, or serve them to other people as part of ethnic dishes. Nikolai Jumagaliev was found innocent for reason of insanity, and interned in a mental institution and is currently serving his sentence.